America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Jordan Bruno, vice president of Job Creators Network.
You can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. Today, we're joined by Jill Homan. Jill is a mom of two, a conservative, a Christian, and a business owner. She worked for John Deere Corporation in Cary, North Carolina, and then went to business school and public policy school at Duke University. Today, she runs a real estate company focused on investing in communities in need, including many communities in North Carolina. She joins us today to discuss the benefits of opportunity zones, which were included in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. Jill, welcome to Main Street Matters. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Elaine and Jordan. So excited to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and then explain to us what opportunity zones are, because I think it's probably the least talked about piece of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And I think for sort of policy nerds like all of us, it's so exciting to hear opportunity zones. But in real terms, help people understand first who you are and how you got so interested in it, but then what they are.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So my background, as you mentioned, is I would say beyond that, about approaching 20 years in real estate private equity, focused on investing in emerging neighborhoods. So really had a background on looking at these neighborhoods that a lot of them are low income. And so when the Tax Cut and Jobs Act included opportunity zones, I had some folks point me to it. And they said, Jill, I think you'd find this really interesting. So it started out as 6 pages of legislation within this robust tax bill. And from there, that spawned 544 pages of regulations. And I said these 6 pages, it took 2 years for us to get the regulations. And I would joke that the 6 pages it was very biblical, because every time we read it, we thought, well, maybe it means this, or maybe it means that. But bottom line is, I think the opportunity zone tax incentive is a once in a lifetime tax incentive. And I also know that it's doing good in bringing capital to these communities in need. And more specifically, opportunity zones are designated low-income and moderate-income communities. And about 98% of these opportunity zones are low-income. And so what's interesting is you might hear the media demonize and say, oh, these neighborhoods, look at this neighborhood or that neighborhood, they're not low income, and try to poke holes in what the definition of low income is. But the reality is that, very rarely does the federal government do something absolutely new. And so what they did is they used the exact same definition of low income as they did for new market tax credits. But what you hear from some people on the left is you don't hear people criticize new market tax credits, because that is a well-established tax credit program passed under the Clinton administration. And this is a new tax incentive that was passed under the Trump administration. I think that has attracted some criticism. But the fact is that this is attracting hundreds of billions of dollars into these low-income communities. That was the policy aim. And in its DNA, it was a bipartisan tax incentive that was originally proposed in the House in a bipartisan fashion. It was moved forward in the Senate in a bipartisan fashion. And interestingly enough, opportunity zones was the one thing that both President Trump and President Biden both agreed on, because President Trump made it a key part of his Platinum Plan in 2020. And President Biden made it part of his Build Back Better plan. And so when you actually look and pay attention to projects that are getting done, and cut through all the noise of people trying to politicize a tax incentive at a national level, and you just look at, okay, what's happening on the ground, that's when you actually get the real story of opportunity zones. And I also just point out those earlier facts about the designation of the low-income areas, because it's just important to know that this is bipartisan. It's working. It's bringing capital to these low-income areas, and people who are tracking the capital can see it firsthand in the data that they're tracking.
Interesting. Jill, can you explain what actually the tax advantage is?
Certainly. And so the way to think about opportunity zone, the tax incentive, is that investors, it starts out with a capital gain. And so, and I'll kind of step you through the path of the tax incentive, starting with, the investor. So the investor starts with a capital gain, and you could get the capital gain from, let's say selling some stock. And so, maybe you sell your, you sell your Tesla stock, and you end up with $100,000 or $1 million of capital gain. You take your capital gain and you invest it into what's called a qualified opportunity fund. The qualified opportunity fund could be a fund that's established by yourself, or it could be a fund that is an institutional fund that maybe your JP Morgan investment banker, says, hey, here's an opportunity, a qualified opportunity fund. So you invest those funds into a qualified opportunity fund, and you get a series of tax benefits. And the first benefit is you defer paying capital gains on that gain that you harvested. Let's just say round numbers, the $100,000. You defer paying taxes on that until tax year 2026. And so when this passed in 2017, there was a big deferral, but now we're kind of coming up to the 2026 time period. But you do defer paying taxes on it until 2026. The other some of the other benefits have burned off, so I'll just share with you the two remaining benefits, one of which is the most significant. If you hold that investment for 10 years, all of the appreciation on that fund investment that you made is tax-free. So by way of example, if you take your $100,000 and you invest it into that fund, the fund has specific things that it's allowed to do. One of which is it needs to bring new tangible property to the zone. The other of which is it can substantially improve property. So let's imagine that you take $100,000, you invest it into a fund. That fund, in turn, builds a new multifamily building in this low-income area. And that's what you own for 10 years. When that fund goes to sell it after 10 years of ownership, all of the appreciation in that investment is tax-free. And not only that, part of the reasons in my background's real estate, so a lot of this conversation will be real estate centric, but not only that, but one of the reasons people invest in real estate is to realize and benefit from all of the depreciation benefits. So you might get a check in the mail from a real estate investment, but you might get, say, $1,000 from a real estate investment, but the tax man only thinks that you made $500 because you shielded those benefits from depreciation. And so the benefit is on opportunity zones is you do not have depreciation recapture. So to summarize, you first get the deferral until tax year 2026. Secondly, all of the appreciation on your benefit on the investment is tax-free. And then thirdly, if you invest in an asset, let's say like real estate, and you get depreciation, when you go to sell that investment, there's no depreciation recapture. You just mark your basis up to the fair market value. So these are kind of in the weeds about, these tax incentives, but it's important for people to just understand that it's a series of tax incentives. And the impact for the investor is investors have an opportunity to receive, let's say, a 400 to 500 basis point increase in their returns than a non-opportunity zone investment. And so that's kind of the punchline is it can dramatically amplify your after-tax returns. And that was the impetus to try to attract capital to these areas.
Great. Yeah, that's really helpful for that clarification, because I think even I was under the misunderstanding, I think a lot of people are, is that you can take a capital gain, say from your Tesla stock, and not pay tax on that and just invested it into the opportunity zone. But you're clarifying that, yeah, you just get a deferment on that capital gain, but any capital gains you make on the opportunity investment is tax-free after 10 years.
Correct. And the example, yes. And in that example, it's, you have $100,000 gain, you're going to pay tax, albeit it's deferred.
Yeah.
But then once you make that investment, all of that is tax-free.
Interesting. Well, yeah, I can tell that's a huge incentive, given how overtaxed we are, to invest in these up and coming zones. Where would an ordinary person like our listeners, who say have benefited from the run up in asset prices in the past couple of years, go to look for these qualifying opportunity zone opportunities?
Well, what I would suggest is, if folks are looking for more resources, there's an accounting company that has done a great job of being a really robust data site for folks to learn more about the mechanics of opportunity zones. And that's Novogradac. So Novogradac, they have an Opportunity Zones Resource Center. EIG is an organization, a think tank that has done advocacy on behalf of opportunity zones. They produce a lot of research around where opportunity zones are going. In terms of your investment opportunities, there are institutional funds that are available. So I would recommend, talk to your traditional banker. So if you have a wealth advisor with Bank of America or, Goldman, you can go to your wealth advisor. They do have, I would expect they still have some funds on their platform. I am a registered investment advisor representative, and so I've worked with families on allocating capital. And then I'm also a partner in a fund, Pinnacle Partners, that has a series of projects. But happy to, be helpful to folks in any way.
I wonder if you can just sort of tell us, I understand the real impact to an investor, but I wonder if you could describe what the real impact to a community is, as particularly a lower income, mostly minority community, which, Senator Tim Scott, who really championed these and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, really speaks in terms of how this can help minority communities by helping minority entrepreneurs, as well as employing minority employees in the workforce, and getting potentially young kids who may be more apt to get in trouble and go a different direction to actually work and contribute within the community.
Yeah, and so there are opportunities and projects across the country. And in fact, there was a recent hearing on the Opportunity Zone tax incentive that showcased some of the projects. And what I would point to are really maybe two communities that you would not think of as attracting institutional capital. You have Erie, Pennsylvania, which has been a site of a congressional hearing because of how the community had banded together, and you had the leaders, the business leaders of the community, help form and help capitalize a fund to then in turn fund some local projects in Erie, Pennsylvania. And then you have Opportunity Alabama. So in Alabama, similarly, you had business leaders that stood up an organization that became an advocacy organization for Alabama. And you had people that every day they woke up and thought, how can I attract capital to our communities? And what they did is they set about finding projects and helping those investors that had, helping sponsors of projects connect with capital. And so they really raised local money and used that money to then go out and source capital. And so I know firsthand, I've had several investors of mine, and me personally, I've invested in a project in Alabama that if you asked me before Opportunity Zones, would you invest in a project of Alabama? I thought, well, no, because the fact is, Alabama does not appear on the top 10 lists or of, top cities of where institutional capital wants to be. But it goes to show you, and it really begs the question that, because of what a great job this group did in advocating, but because of opportunity zones, and but not for opportunity zones, a lot of these projects would have never gotten funded. And the projects span the gamut. Again, my lens, a lot of it is real estate, but I know of other projects. But I've seen multifamily housing, so apartments being built, have seen and know about projects that are, a hotel that is in a low-income area that got funded in a historic building and used a combination of historic tax credits with opportunity zone tax incentives, and finally getting this jewel of a boutique hotel in this community funded. And then also know of projects where you might just have a business owner that is using their own funds, and they're going to they're going to buy a building in a community and use opportunity zone funds to buy that building and renovate that building to make it their headquarters. And then there's manufacturing. There's manufacturers that have relocated and started manufacturing processes in an opportunity zone. And so that was, they stood up this manufacturing facility. There's a group called Verde Funds. And so it's a venture capital opportunity zone fund that's run by Lynn Mills. And he does some really interesting projects. And he's, for example, capitalized a young entrepreneur who, African-American gentleman, who started a animation and film studio, and that relocated in Baltimore, inner city Baltimore, and they stood up their facility. And there's people who've capitalized urgent cares in these communities, and it just is a whole scope of different types of projects. Everything on the real estate side to really interesting, creative operating businesses. And so that's, again, I think this is a once in a lifetime tax incentive for investors and also for communities, because when you hear the criticism, what you hear is, opportunity zones hasn't solved the war on poverty. And it's just, well, wait a second. So you mean the 60-year war on poverty, a tax incentive that's 6 years old, hasn't solved the 60. So when people criticize the tax incentive, what they're trying to do is expand and say this will be the panacea for everything and solve and cure everything. But it's very important to understand that this is a tax incentive to bring capital to these areas, because we think if you bring capital to these areas, as you described, you're bringing jobs, you're making it more attractive for investment for people to fund their businesses. And so it's achieving its policy ends. And I'd encourage your listeners to reach out to their accountants and their lawyers if they're not familiar. Check out, as I mentioned, these websites with Novogradac and EIG. They do a great job of providing resources. And I'm happy to be helpful in any way and, of course, answer questions.
I was going to ask you, what are the criticisms? Are there any other criticisms of these opportunity zones? It seems like if you've got Joe Biden and Donald Trump on the same page on something, what could be the criticisms?
Well, what I've heard, some of it is where these zones are designated, and what's interesting, I've had a reporter talk to me and say, "Well, what do you think about the designation of the New York opportunity zones?" And I said, "Well, first of all, the designations were done by the governors, and so if anybody has an issue with where these zones are designated." It lies, first of all, they're adhering to the letter of the law and the regulation, which is these are designated low-income areas and moderate income areas, but overwhelmingly low-income areas. But then out of all the low-income areas and moderate income areas that were eligible, the governors picked which ones. And so the fault lies, but I don't think that's fault. But if one is to criticize, what you have are reporters that don't have their facts and don't have their information right, which is why I'm always happy to, help educate them. And, and just explain to them that, that was the governor at the time picked those zones. So you might want to talk to his staff about why they picked those zones. But I hear that, and I just hear an effort to try to make opportunity zones. There's a recent article in the New York Times that was critical of opportunity zones in its headline, and it said, opportunity zones fall short. But again, the fact is, and it made references to the war on poverty, excuse me. But the fact is opportunity zones wasn't formed to be the solution for the war on poverty. It is one tool in a toolkit for economic development in a community. And when you actually read the article in the New York Times, you realize that it was actually very positive on the tax incentive, but that reporter was trying to say, well, it's doing some good, but it's not doing enough. And what the reporter went to Alabama and criticized what they were doing in Alabama. But again, to my earlier point, the reporter missed the whole point. The very fact the reporter was in Alabama begs the question, and not in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, which are the top institutional markets. The very fact that this reporter went to Alabama begs the question that yes, it is doing good. And so that's why I'm all about government that works. I'm all about being innovative to attract capital to areas in need, and that's why I'm an advocate for opportunity zones, is because I've seen firsthand on the good work that's happening, and I've also seen and met the people who are really trying to do the right thing and bring capital to these areas.
Jill, I was going to jump in with one particular criticism that I've heard, and I'm sure you've heard it in your 20 years in this before too, and it's the idea that economic development gentrifies neighborhoods and pushes out renters who can no longer afford it. How do you respond to that objection?
Well, I think so. When people are talking about gentrification, what they do is they really are. I think it's all about where a person is in the conversation of gentrification, because if you are a single mother, African American woman who's owned her home for 30 years, and now your community is designated an opportunity zone, what you've seen in a lot of these neighborhoods is some price appreciation. So in that sense, if for this homeowner, that price appreciation is a good thing. Okay. So on the other hand, if the criticism is about, gentrification, that means the price of the rents as pushing up to the point that it's unaffordable, then that is a conversation of let's talk about housing affordability. Let's not use these code words of gentrification, because I just explained how gentrification can help people, but let's not use code words. And so when we talk about housing affordability, let's do a thought exercise. Let's take all 8,700 opportunity zones and let's imagine that we build all multifamily buildings. So all 5 apartments in every single 8,700 opportunity zones. And what do you think would happen? Well, the obvious answer is if we oversupply a market with housing, what you're going to have is a crater, like the rents will shoot down because now all of a sudden we're oversupplied with housing. And so the people who criticize about gentrification do not understand the basics of how economics work, which is a lot of these cities, they put up such constraints to building housing that it causes housing and the supply to be pushed down, which creates an inflation and increases the rents. So it's not opportunity zones. It's the fact that you have to, in Washington, D.C., you have to go through all these layers to get approval. You have historic zones, which, it looks pretty, but when you're paying your lawyer, your land use lawyer, your architect, all making hundreds and hundreds of dollars an hour to sit with you in a meeting that lasts 4 hours to then have this unelected panel of people tell you that you need to cut off 3 floors of your building and make it even smaller, and now your pro forma doesn't work, so you need to increase rents. Like, you wonder why housing is so expensive. And
No,
so
that's a
that's
great
my
point.
point.
My last question is opportunity zones that are set to expire with the rest of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. What would you say to voters, considering making their decision this fall about taxes and tax opportunities?
So I first just want to talk about the deadline really quick, and that is, so investors have until the end of tax year 2026 to make an investment. And if investors, and in turn, if someone has a business that they'd like to attract capital with, and utilize that incentive, similarly, they're under a similar time frame. But once somebody makes an investment, they're like, that does not expire, but it's just, you got to get in before the end of tax year 2026. But, the question as you raise is a great one, which is, what happens? Is there going to be an Opportunity Zones 2.0? And what I would suggest is that, the candidate on the conservative side has indicated and given all indications that there is a strong interest in economic development tools that work. And so that's why I've been trying to be helpful to folks on the team and trying to share, not only like, let's extend this, but also, let's think about what an Opportunity Zones 2.0 looks like, and let's bring in more capital, because, this isn't a government program. This isn't like money that's appropriated. This is money from the people that was sitting in the stock market, or, Bitcoin, or it's your coin collection, or your, wine collection. But, these were assets that weren't generating revenue. And now now they're being deployed essentially into these areas. And so that's why it has an opportunity to exponentially bring in more capital. And I think that's what is very exciting if we can get, the right folks in office to continue putting in place programs and tax incentives that work.
Well, Jill, what are some of the ideas, if you had a magic wand and you could sort of come up with a 2.0, what are some things you'd like to see to improve them?
Well, big picture, I like the idea of making more capital eligible to receive tax benefits. Because if fundamentally the idea is, let's bring in capital to these areas and let's encourage long-term holds and long-term investing in these areas, then, why not about, salary income? That's tax, and it's taxed at a higher rate, but, why not have my, take some of my salary that I made and invest in a fund? I'm paying a tax on that, and then I'll hold that for a period of time. And I think that would really expand the eligibility of folks who might not have gains. And also, for in markets with a lot of market volatility, the investment in Opportunity Zones, what I've found, it really tracks the equities market, the stock market. So meaning, if it goes up, there's a whole lot of investors want to take some money off the sidelines when it was going down, or all the volatility. There's been less interest, even though you could use any type of capital gain. So that would be one of them. And I think just another, a second one would be this idea of redesignating some zones. And I think in some states, I think either the folks that were implementing it, or these are all tied to a census tract, which is a number. But there are some designations that leave me kind of scratching my head of, why is this zone, which is entirely in a military base, an Opportunity Zone? Or why is this zone, it seems accidental because it's entirely in a residential neighborhood? Why is this a zone? Because you don't really want to, bring capital into a neighborhood. I mean, it's a neighborhood. You're not, that to me, you'd be pushing people out. And I think there were, I'm not sure what happened, and but nonetheless, I like this idea of almost having a, I call it a mulligan, or maybe that speaks more to my golf game that I'm like, I always need mulligans. But I like the idea of enabling governors to redesignate zones and freshen it up, or even on a 2.0 saying, okay, 1.0, let's have new designations for 2.0. So those would be two, is to relook at, let's kind of move the capital around where we want the capital to be. And then also let's expand on what's eligible for the type of capital. Because again, this isn't money that's appropriated. And I think as we're looking at really high, deficit numbers from the federal government, I think, as we need to be innovative, and I just am really, really interested in programs that are able to leverage private capital to achieve these public goods.
I think those are really good options. And I just want to thank you for coming on and really explaining the opportunity zone piece. I think that's really been a missing link in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and the overall success of it. So I think it's important to talk about even more. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Thank you all to our audience for taking the time to tune in and listen to this important issue. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from, and we'll be back soon with a new episode.